In 2010, the disappearance of Michael Harris, a young mountaineer, became one of the greatest mysteries in recent climbing history. He was on an ambitious mission to conquer Mount McKinley, the most challenging mountain in North America. Climbing this ice and rock giant is an achievement that only a few dare to attempt, and Michael knew that. But what no one could predict was that his solitary journey across the vast Alaskan wilderness would take unimaginable turns. He set out with a clear goal: to push his own limits, to test his courage in one of the harshest environments on the planet. However, when McKinley swallowed his footprints and communication was lost, a disturbing question arose. Had he simply succumbed to the ruthless forces of nature, or was there something more behind his disappearance? Michael's story wasn't just about his climb. It was about what he was searching for on that icy peak, what he might have discovered there, something no one knows for sure to this day. For 5 long years, the case remained frozen in time, with no answers, until an unexpected clue resurfaced, offering a new perspective on what really happened. What was found in 2015 could change everything. And with that, the search for the truth became more dangerous than ever. But could it be that the mountain had something more to reveal? Something so extraordinary that Michael would pay with his life to uncover it. Michael Harris was a 25-year-old with an adventurous spirit and an uncontrollable passion for climbing. From a young age, he dreamed of facing great challenges, pushing the boundaries of what seemed possible. Mount McKinley, standing at 20,110 feet, is one of the most imposing and treacherous mountains in the world. For many, climbing McKinley is a lifetime achievement. For Michael, however, the mountain represented something more, a chance to prove to himself that he could face the impossible. The ascent was meticulously planned, and despite the obvious risks, he was determined to reach the summit, something that only a few have had the courage to try, especially alone. But the mountain, with its inhospitable and unpredictable weather, was no easy adversary. During those days, Michael seemed up for the challenge. However, what began as a solitary journey of personal achievement soon turned into an enigma. At some point during the climb, communication with the outside world was lost. The search began almost immediately, but McKinley, with its ice walls and biting winds, proved to be an impenetrable fortress. Days turned into weeks, then months, and soon desperation set in. What had happened to Michael? Had he fallen victim to the extreme conditions, or was there something else at play? The sense of loss was profound, not only for his family and friends, but for the entire mountaineering community. The case became marked by uncertainty and the absence of answers. Those who knew him, especially his parents and siblings, were immersed in an ocean of pain and helplessness, not knowing if Michael was still alive or if McKinley had swallowed him whole, leaving no trace. The searches, intense as they were, failed to bring any answers. It was as though Michael had become just another victim of the mountain, his fate sealed by the vast, icy expanse and the brutality of the climate. However, as is often the case with mysterious stories, the silence was broken in an unexpected way. In 2015, a group of scientists on an expedition in the remote areas of McKinley found something astonishing. Michael's climbing gear, lost and seemingly abandoned, along with an object no one could explain. What was that object? And what did it indicate about what really happened to Michael? The clue raised a series of new questions. The discovery suggested that Michael had gone further than anyone had imagined, perhaps reaching an unexplored point on the mountain before disappearing. Was it possible that he had made a geological discovery, or uncovered something that challenged the conventional understanding of the region? Or could it be that the mountain, with its hidden secrets, was about to reveal a truth that could change everything people thought they knew about his disappearance? as the discovery gained attention. But with it came new questions, new possibilities, and most importantly, a new meaning for what once seemed to be a tragic disappearance. McKinley, with its reputation for being unforgiving and inhuman, seemed to hide more than any climber could have imagined. And what Michael may have found, if he found anything, could finally answer a question no one dared ask anymore. What really happened to him? The news of Michael Harris's disappearance was like an electric shock to his family. For his mother, Martha, and his father, Richard, that cold morning in 2010, which had started like any other, turned into a nightmare that seemed endless. They had heard about his ambitions and knew of their son's courage in risking everything to climb the highest mountains. But they never imagined that it would lead them to something like this. Michael wasn't a reckless adventurer. He was meticulous, disciplined, and always prepared with extreme caution for every expedition. However, Mount McKinley, the giant of ice and rock, was a place where even the most experienced could get lost. The news of his disappearance hit everyone with unexpected force, putting Michael's family at the epicenter of a tragedy with no answers. The pain and anguish of the Harris family ran deep, and a sense of helplessness hung in the air. Martha and Richard couldn't accept the idea that their son, so well prepared, had fallen victim to the mountain's relentless weather. What could have happened to him? There were so many questions and so few answers. The uncertainty gnawed at them as the weeks passed without any sign of Michael. The desire to know the truth blended with the fear that, with each passing day, the chances of finding him alive were growing slimmer. The pain of loss wasn't yet something concrete, but the feeling of being on the verge of an even greater tragedy grew closer, leaving them completely unmoored. In the days that followed, Michael's family did everything they could to cooperate with the authorities and rescue teams, hoping to find any clue that could lead them to their son. The search stretched on for weeks, with specialized teams scouring the mountain for any trace of Michael. However, the vastness and enormity of McKinley made the task nearly impossible. The geography of the region, with its enormous glaciers, cutting winds, and extreme temperatures, made any attempt to find a trace feel like an impossible mission. Each day without answers fueled the family's despair, while the sense that the mountain had taken Michael forever grew stronger. The pain of not knowing what had really happened to him consumed them. Martha, in particular, couldn't understand why her son, so strong and determined, was now lost in such a merciless place. The suffering of not having a body, no concrete evidence that Michael was truly lost, made the situation even more painful. It was as if Michael's disappearance was trapped in a limbo between life and death. They didn't know if he was still alive somewhere on the mountain or if he had already succumbed to the cruel forces of McKinley. Every day, Martha wondered if it would have been different if she had understood more about the risks of climbing, if she had done something to stop him from going alone. Guilt began to take over her mind, even though she knew she couldn't control Michael's choices. It was his dream, and he was determined to see it through no matter the obstacles. But that didn't make the pain any easier to bear. Michael's parents weren't alone in their anguish. His siblings, especially Emily, his younger sister, were also consumed by the suffering. Emily always remembered Michael as someone who lived with a fire in his heart, someone with uncontrollable energy and passion. The brother she had admired in her youth was now lost somewhere, and she felt powerless to help him. In their conversations, she shared childhood memories, joyful moments full of laughter, trying to keep a spark of hope alive, even when the evidence pointed to the worst. But time was passing, and the possibilities seemed to shrink with each day. The emptiness left by the lack of answers made the family question their own reality. It was as if, with every step, the mountain had swallowed more than just Michael. It had taken with it the sense of peace and safety that once existed in the Harris home. Their world had been completely turned upside down, and the pain of not knowing what happened to Michael occupied an irremovable space in their lives. McKinley, which for many was just a mountain, became a massive, unknowable enemy. From that moment on, Martha and Richard lived with the feeling that nothing would ever be the same. Every time they looked at Emily or their friends, the memory of Michael seemed more distant, as if he was being erased by the vastness of nature. The uncertainty gnawed at them, and with every day without answers, the weight of the loss became even more unbearable. It wasn't until years later, when the case seemed lost, that something unexpected happened. In 2015, during a scientific expedition in the McKinley region, a group of climbers and researchers found something important: a piece of climbing equipment that had belonged to Michael. The object, when analyzed, brought a new wave of hope, but also raised new questions. How could the equipment be so far from the place where he had disappeared? What did this indicate? Had Michael made it to a higher point on the mountain before vanishing? This clue, found after so much time, reignited the investigation and brought back the pain and mystery that had hung over the family for years. However, the discovery, instead of bringing immediate relief, also raised more questions than answers. The pain of not knowing what had really happened to Michael resurfaced, now with the addition of a new mystery. What had he found on the mountain? Was there something there that could have changed the course of his expedition? The clue didn't offer a direct explanation, but it sparked a new flame of curiosity and tension. Martha and Richard's anguish, though perhaps slightly relieved by the possibility of understanding what happened to Michael, also intensified. Was this the end of the mystery, or the opening to something even bigger? 5 years after Michael Harris's disappearance, the case seemed lost in the vast emptiness of McKinley's mountains. During that time, the mystery of what really happened to the young mountaineer felt insurmountable. The search had been exhaustive, but nothing had been found beyond the silence. For Michael's family, especially his parents, Martha and Richard, the waiting without answers became a constant anguish, an indescribable pain from the lack of closure. What could have happened to him? There was an immense desire to solve the puzzle, but the questions were so many that the truth seemed farther and farther away. With each passing year, the case seemed to fade into the mist of forgetfulness until, surprisingly, a twist would bring the mystery back to the surface, dramatically and unsettlingly. In 2015, nearly 5 years after Michael disappeared in the vast glaciers and biting winds of McKinley, a scientific expedition took place in the same area where the young mountaineer had last been seen. The group was there to study the mountain's geographical conditions, but what they found would change the course of the entire investigation. In the middle of the frozen, remote vastness of the mountain, one of the researchers found a piece of climbing equipment that, to everyone's surprise, belonged to Michael. The find wasn't just an ordinary piece of gear. It was in an unexpected place, far from Michael's last known position. The fact that the equipment was there in such a remote and dangerous area challenged all previous theories about what could have happened to the mountaineer. Michael, it seemed, had gone much farther than anyone had imagined, pushing the limits of his strength and facing McKinley's extremes. The discovery of the gear raised new questions about his journey on that mountain. But it wasn't just the equipment that caused a stir among investigators. Along with it, a mysterious object was found, something that immediately challenged the initial explanations. What could that object be? It didn't appear to be conventional climbing gear or anything related to the climbing activities. It seemed to be something completely different, something that, according to experts, could even be an item from another expedition or something previously unknown. The mysterious object was a key that, when analyzed, would open a new door of possibilities. What did it mean? Why was it there, next to Michael's gear? How did this connect to his disappearance? For Michael's family, The impact of the discovery was profound. They began to wonder if Michael had found something important before disappearing, perhaps a geological discovery or a trace of something larger and more significant. This possibility brought new waves of anxiety and curiosity. What had he found, and why would that be so relevant to his disappearance? As investigations into the object and Michael's gear intensified, theories emerged that went far beyond what had been considered up to that point. The hypothesis that Michael had simply succumbed to the cold and the mountain's relentless winds was questioned. The fact that he had gone so far and left his equipment in such a distant location suggested that he was trying to reach something, that he might have made an important discovery before disappearing. Some suggested that he might have found a rare geological formation, or something of scientific value, something that motivated him to keep climbing, pushing beyond his own limits and the extreme conditions. The idea that Michael was searching for a scientific discovery began to gain traction. But there were also those who believed that the object found alongside Michael's gear could be some sort of clue left by someone, perhaps by another mountaineer or someone who had been on the mountain before. These theories multiplied quickly, each more intriguing than the last, but none were able to offer a definitive explanation of what had really happened. For climbing experts, the fact that Michael had left his gear in such a remote area indicated that he was in a desperate situation, perhaps trying to save his life, or that he had somehow been forced to abandon his items. But why had he not been found before? McKinley is a mountain that doesn't forgive mistakes, but the location of Michael's gear, seemingly intact, suggested that he had made a tremendous effort to continue his ascent. The enigma became more and more complicated as more information surfaced, with no clear clue to clarify the real reason for his death or disappearance. Questions about the mysterious object found beside the gear began to dominate discussions among investigators. What could that item be? No one knew for sure. It appeared to have been placed intentionally next to Michael's gear, but for a purpose no one could identify. Attempts to identify its origin or its connection to Michael's disappearance were unsuccessful. Some theorized that it could be a tool used by another expedition, left behind or lost. Others, however, suggested that it was something Michael himself had found on the mountain, perhaps an object with greater significance, something that motivated him to keep climbing, to go further than any mountaineer would dare. The mystery surrounding the object intensified as more analyses were done, and no one could come to a conclusive explanation. The object seemed to be a key to understanding what really happened, but it was beyond anyone's reach. Meanwhile, Michael's family, who had already endured years of anguish from the lack of answers, found themselves once again immersed in uncertainty. The new discoveries brought back intense emotions of loss, but also a renewed hope that maybe, finally, they could understand what happened to Michael. With every new clue, every new analysis, more doubts arose, but also more possibilities. The discovery of the gear and the mysterious object wasn't an end, but the beginning of a new phase in the search for the truth. For Michael's family, pain and hope intertwined in complex ways. They had already suffered deeply from the absence of their son, but now, with the possibility of an explanation, the weight of pain mixed with the fear that the truth, when finally revealed, might be harder to handle than the mystery itself. For investigators, the discovery was a turning point. They were now faced with a new set of information that completely changed the direction of the investigation. McKinley, a massive and impenetrable mountain, seemed to have kept more than just a mountaineer's body within its depths. It might have hidden valuable secrets, perhaps even a geological mystery no one had ever imagined. Michael, with his search for challenges and something greater than himself, might have come across something beyond the understanding of any mountaineer. What he found and what he took with him were now questions that needed answers. But as the investigation moved forward, the feeling that the truth was near mixed with the frustration
that it might be more elusive than anyone had imagined. The discovery of 2015, with the gear and the mysterious object, brought a new wave of speculation and renewed interest in the case.
What did Michael Harris really find on McKinley? What did he see or discover before disappearing? These questions, still unanswered, continue to haunt those involved in the case and everyone who feels connected to Michael's story. After the unexpected discovery of Michael Harris's climbing gear and the mysterious object found in the remote glaciers of McKinley, the disappearance of the young mountaineer took on a new perspective. What had once seemed like a simple case of misfortune now transformed into a profound mystery full of nuances, a complex puzzle, with pieces beginning to align in an intriguing way. The clue found in 2015 reignited the investigation with renewed intensity. Experts from various fields, from experienced climbers to geographers and climatologists, were called in to analyze the new data and try to figure out what had really happened to Michael. What had seemed like a simple piece of evidence now appeared to be the key to a series of unanswered questions. The investigation was no longer limited to a superficial examination of the disappearance, but had become a deep reanalysis of all the details of the expedition and the circumstances surrounding the case. The first approach of the investigators was to revisit Michael's original expedition and all the decisions he made before his fateful journey. What was the route he had planned? What risks was he willing to take? Could it be that he had made a mistake by underestimating the extreme conditions of McKinley? Every detail was reviewed. The maps, reports from other climbers in the same area, and Michael's own notes, if any, about the route and conditions he encountered on the ascent. The initial impression was that Michael had prepared adequately. He wasn't an inexperienced climber, but someone who knew the risks involved. However, upon revisiting the climatic data from that period, the investigators began to realize that some factors might have been underestimated, and that ended up playing a crucial role in his disappearance. McKinley, as many climbers know, is a treacherous mountain. Its unpredictable weather and challenging geography can swallow even the most experienced. In particular, the region where Michael disappeared is known to be one of the most dangerous parts of the mountain, with large glaciers and icy winds that can quickly reduce visibility and make any rescue almost impossible. But by analyzing the specific weather conditions during Michael's ascent, something became clear. An unexpected storm was approaching during the days he was on the mountain, a factor that could have strongly influenced his decision to keep climbing. It was possible that Michael, in his desire to reach the summit, hadn't considered the devastating force of the storms that quickly formed. Maybe he continued the expedition, thinking he could outrun the storm before it hit its peak, or perhaps he underestimated its intensity. This possibility was raised, but there was no way to confirm it, as Michael was alone and out of contact with the outside world. Alongside the climatic analyses, the investigators also began to examine the discoveries made in expeditions prior to Michael's. Climbers who had ascended McKinley in the weeks leading up to his disappearance were interviewed, and some information started to emerge, but with an unexpected perspective. Some of them reported having noticed abnormal weather conditions in the area and mentioned that the mountain was particularly treacherous that year. There were mentions of sudden storms, winds stronger than usual, and reduced visibility that made any movement risky. However, what stood out the most to the investigators were mentions of strange behaviors during the searches for Michael. Some climbers seemed to have more information than they initially indicated. During interviews, unusual statements emerged, suggesting that Michael might not have been the only one in the area. These reports began to cast doubt on the initial theory that he had been completely alone on the mountain. Furthermore, the investigation revealed that Michael's decision to climb McKinley alone may have been bolder than initially thought. Although he was a skilled climber, the decision to go without a team or even without proper emergency communication systems was questioned. The lack of contact with the outside world, combined with the extreme conditions of the environment, increased Michael's vulnerability. The absence of communication, especially in the case of a sudden storm, made any rescue attempt even harder. But what intrigued the investigators even more was that, after the storm, the search efforts began to be conducted very hastily, perhaps due to the belief that Michael was already lost forever. This only fueled further theories that something was being omitted or, at the very least, misinterpreted. As the mountaineering experts revisited the routes that Michael had followed, a new theory emerged. Michael had not just gotten lost or been the victim of a climbing accident. The hypothesis gaining traction was that he might have found something significant, something that motivated him to continue his ascent even in the face of harsh weather conditions. Since the mountain was in a geologically active area, with various crevices and exposed layers of rock, some geologists suggested that Michael might have found a rare formation, perhaps even an unknown type of mineral. This theoretical discovery gained strength as new data and reports began to accumulate. The object found alongside Michael's gear indicated that he had been driven to continue his journey, even when conditions were becoming increasingly challenging. But what exactly had he found there, at one of the most remote points on the mountain? The mysterious object, with its unknown origin, began to be analyzed in more detail. Some investigators believed it could have geological value, related to an important scientific discovery. Others suggested it might have been left by another climber, or even by a previous expedition, but no one could explain how it ended up so close to Michael's gear. The doubt about its origin and purpose continued to grow, without any conclusive conclusions. Meanwhile, the analysis of the equipment found with the object also began to generate new speculations. The condition of the equipment indicated that Michael hadn't been caught off guard. He seemed to have made a conscious effort to continue, as if he had a mission or a greater goal. What did he know at that moment, and why had he risked so much? Another line of investigation that gained strength was the possible failure in Michael's safety precautions. What experts discovered was that, despite being an experienced climber, he had overlooked some essential precautions. The lack of satellite tracking, for example, was a significant oversight, given McKinley's vast and isolated terrain. The absence of modern emergency communication devices and the choice to climb alone, without the protection of a support team, made his situation more vulnerable than it initially appeared. Perhaps, if he had taken these precautions, his death or disappearance could have been avoided. The lack of communication equipment was also a critical factor. Even if Michael was trying to find something of value, the inability to alert others to his dangerous situation meant that any emergency would be harder to manage. As all these new discoveries and theories emerged, a sense of uncertainty settled in. What really happened to Michael Harris? The investigation was more complex than ever, with so many possibilities and contradictory clues coming up along the way. McKinley, with its unresolved mysteries, seemed to hold more than just the bodies of lost climbers. It also hid the secrets of those brave enough to challenge it. Every new discovery, every new theory seemed like another false lead, but at the same time, it suggested that Michael, in some way, had found something that pushed him to go further, to challenge the very limits of the mountain. As the investigation into Michael Harris's disappearance advanced, new characters began to emerge in the plot. With each new encounter, the mystery seemed to grow even more intense. The case, which had already been marked by pain and uncertainty, started to unfold in a setting with multiple layers of complexity, involving not just mountaineers and investigators, but also a series of interactions and behaviors that led to new suspicions and theories. With the discovery of the equipment and the mysterious object, the investigators began seeking information from other expeditions that had occurred around the same time, looking for clues or witnesses that could shed light on what really happened to Michael. Some of these climbers, who were directly involved in the search efforts, became key players in the investigation. Others, who had climbed McKinley during the same period, had reports that could help fill in the gaps left by Michael's disappearance. The first significant encounter happened with an experienced climber, Thomas Brooks, who had been in the McKinley Mountains just before Michael set out on his fatal ascent. Thomas had a long career as a mountaineer and had faced some of the world's most challenging peaks, but his experience that year would become a key piece in the investigation. In an interview with the investigators, he recalled noticing something peculiar about the rescue teams during the days leading up to Michael's disappearance. He remembered a specific event. While he was in a relatively safe area of the mountain, he had the impression that some members of the rescue teams were acting hastily and somewhat disorganized, which was unusual for such experienced professionals. Thomas, with the calm and discernment of a seasoned climber, pointed out that in his opinion, the search was not being conducted efficiently, which might have contributed to the failure of attempts to find Michael in a timely manner. However, what really raised suspicions during the interview was Thomas's mention of a strange behavior he witnessed during one of the searches. He told the investigators that, at one point, he had noticed an unusual action by one of the rescuers. A team member, who seemed to have in-depth knowledge of the mountain, had wandered off from the others and disappeared from view for several hours. When he returned, he seemed hurried and visibly agitated, without offering any explanations about what he had done or found. Thomas was left with the impression that something was wrong, but he couldn't pinpoint exactly what had occurred. That gap in information created a sense of unease, as it raised the possibility that the search efforts weren't just ineffective, but that someone might have been acting suspiciously. The doubt about this strange behavior fed into a new line of investigation. Was it possible that someone had deliberately delayed the search, or even been hiding information? The investigation continued with additional interviews, and the focus turned to another climber, a man named Richard Matthews, who had been in the region during the same time as Michael. Richard, known for his technical skill in high-risk climbs, appeared willing to cooperate with the investigators. However, when questioned about Michael's behavior before his ascent, Richard became evasive, which piqued the investigators' curiosity even further. When pressed about his knowledge of Michael's expedition, Richard revealed that he had briefly encountered Michael at one of the nearby camps a few hours before the young climber disappeared. During this meeting, Richard claimed that Michael appeared very focused on his climb, but distant, as if he was obsessed with something beyond the mountain. Richard, however, seemed hesitant to provide more details. He mentioned that their conversation was brief, but there was something about that exchange that he couldn't forget. Richard's evasive behavior became a turning point in the investigation. Why didn't he want to share more about what had occurred between him and Michael? Did he know more about what Michael was looking for on the mountain than he was willing to reveal? The investigators began to consider the possibility that Richard was hiding something. Some questioned whether he knew more about what Michael had found, or perhaps about some dynamics of competition or even rivalry between climbers that could have influenced the disappearance. This raised a fundamental question. Could it be that another climber, perhaps unintentionally, interfered with Michael's plans, whether due to competition or a misinterpretation of the situation? At another point in the investigation, even more unsettling information came to light. Some of the members of the rescue team reported that, during the efforts to find Michael, certain witness reports had been disregarded or even suppressed. This discovery led to a new line of thought. Was it possible that the authorities and search teams were more interested in closing the case quickly than in actually solving the mystery? There were speculations that local authorities were eager to avoid more negative publicity about McKinley, especially after a series of incidents involving lost climbers in the region in recent years. The behavior of the rescue teams, as pointed out by Thomas and other members of the expedition, suggested that at some point, the focus on searching for Michael had diminished, perhaps due to external pressures. The idea that a failure in coordinating the search efforts could have contributed to the disappearance was now more evident than ever. For Michael's family, this new information was devastating. Martha and Richard Harris, Michael's parents, had always trusted the authorities, believing that everything possible was being done to bring their son home. However, with the new discoveries about the behavior of certain rescue team members and suspicions about the lack of commitment in the search efforts, they began to question the motivations behind those actions. The pain of Michael's disappearance was now amplified by the feeling that, for some reason, the truth might have been hidden. This new reality was hard to swallow. Could incompetence, or even something more sinister, have affected the chances of finding Michael? Additionally, another factor began to be raised during the investigations. The possibility that Michael, in his obsessive pursuit of self-overcoming, had found something that motivated him to keep climbing, even as conditions became unbearable. Many mountaineers struggle with the psychological weight of mountains, and the obsession with reaching the summit, especially of a peak as imposing as McKinley, could have clouded Michael's judgment. Had he taken more risks than he should have, possibly in search of a scientific discovery or perhaps to prove something to himself? But there was also a more disturbing possibility. What if, by chance, he had discovered something he wasn't supposed to, something others were willing to hide? The mystery seemed to deepen as more information emerged, and each new encounter revealed an even more complex facet of the puzzle. The meetings with these key characters and the contradictory behaviors that began to surface only deepened the mystery. What was really going on behind the scenes of the search for Michael? The questions began to pile up in an agonizing way, and the case, which had already been a personal tragedy, started to evolve into a broader enigma, with implications that went far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The truth, when it was finally revealed, could be more complex and more obscure than anyone involved was prepared to face. As the investigation into Michael Harris's disappearance deepened, new revelations began to emerge, challenging everyone's initial understanding of the case. What had once seemed like a tragic accident, caused by the relentless conditions of McKinley, was now taking on more complex turns, raising suspicions that human errors and wrong decisions played a crucial role in Michael's fate. With each new detail uncovered, the layers of mystery grew thicker, and the assumptions about Michael's disappearance were gradually dismantled. The first significant revelation came from the analysis of safety conditions during Michael's expedition. Upon reviewing his equipment and climbing procedures, the investigators noticed several important mistakes that could have compromised Michael's safety during his journey. Although he was an experienced mountaineer, the lack of a modern communication system and the decision to climb alone were pointed out as serious flaws. In many high-risk expeditions, constant communication with base camp is essential, especially in treacherous mountains like McKinley. Michael, however, seemed to rely on old equipment and his own abilities, without considering technological improvements that could have saved his life. This lack of preparation, though unintentional, contributed to his vulnerability in his final hours. He had underestimated the mountain and his own limits, ignoring the risks of isolation and extreme weather conditions. This scenario was reinforced by the review of reports from mountaineers who were nearby McKinley at the time. They began to recall their interactions with Michael before his ascent and the general conditions of the area. Most reports indicated that the weather conditions had been incredibly unstable and, in some cases, even dangerous. There were reports of strong winds and sudden snowstorms that made any rescue efforts nearly impossible. Some climbers said they had observed Michael acting more confidently than usual, which made them question whether he was ignoring the clear signs that the mountain was not welcoming him. He appeared determined, even obsessed, with reaching the summit. This relentless focus, a trait of many elite mountaineers, was now seen in a different light. What had initially seemed like bravery now appeared to be a reckless quest, perhaps even foolhardy, for something greater than himself. But what was Michael really seeking? The real turning point in the investigation came when the investigators began to review the records of the rescue teams. They discovered that, after Michael's disappearance, a series of tactical mistakes had been made during the search. Some teams became involved in inaccurate and poorly coordinated searches, which delayed the location of Michael. In an environment like McKinley, where every second counts, these mistakes could have been fatal. The time lost in disorganized searches created an even more desperate scenario for those trying to find Michael. However, the investigators began to notice something strange. During one of the interviews with members of the rescue teams, one of them, a veteran named Greg Sanders, revealed that he and other team members had been instructed not to search in a specific area of the mountain. Sanders stated that this area, which coincidentally was where Michael's gear was found years later, had been previously ruled out, despite evidence suggesting Michael could have been there. This fact raised a wave of suspicion. Why was this area ignored? What was there that could have led to the search being redirected so inaccurately? With this information, the investigation gained new momentum. The investigators began questioning the integrity of the search efforts and whether there was any reason why the teams were directed to areas that were off Michael's route. Could the area have been intentionally disregarded? Or perhaps there were other factors, like external pressures, that affected the effectiveness of the rescue operations. The new discoveries raised a series of questions about the priorities of the authorities involved and their real motivations for not following every available lead. The silence around the failures in the search efforts was unusual, and this only fueled the speculation that something was being covered up. As these new revelations became public, other worrying pieces of information began to surface. Around the same time, the McKinley region was facing a significant increase in the number of missing climbers, which had led to growing pressure on local authorities. The rescue teams were overwhelmed, and there were rumors that in some cases, the searches were being managed with more emphasis on time and available resources than on the actual goal of finding the missing. Some members of the mountaineering community, who had worked with authorities on other expeditions, began to question whether the pressure to reduce costs and time in operations had led to hasty decisions. If that were the case, it would partially explain why the search for Michael was not conducted with the necessary attention to every available lead. Among the investigators, there was a growing sense of distrust towards the rescue team members. The evasive behavior of some climbers during interviews, along with reports of failures in the planning of the search efforts, led many to conclude that something more was at play than just human error. Additionally, the lack of information about what really happened between Michael and some of the other climbers before his death gave a sense that certain parts of the case were being concealed. What had Michael discovered before he disappeared? Was there something on the mountain that he had found that shouldn't be revealed? With each new discovery, the mystery seemed to deepen, and the revelations began to suggest that, beyond the forces of nature, human failings, lack of communication, and even possible cover-ups were somehow involved in Michael's disappearance. In the end, a disturbing truth began to emerge. Michael, who had taken risks in search of a grand objective, had been left to fend for himself on a treacherous mountain. Human negligence, lack of communication, and possible concealment of information were the true culprits behind his tragic fate. But behind this story, there was more than just a mistake during an expedition. Michael Harris's story, with all its secrets, flaws, and revelations, became a reflection of the complexities of human nature, where the boundaries between courage and recklessness, the search for truth and hidden interests, often become blurred. After years of uncertainty, speculation, and revelations that only deepened the mystery instead of solving it, the climax of the investigation into Michael Harris's disappearance finally arrived. A final expedition was organized, a last mission with the sole purpose of understanding what had really happened to Michael and, perhaps, finding answers to the secrets that Mount McKinley had been hiding. Previous discoveries, the equipment of Michael and the mysterious object found in a remote area, had reignited interest in the case. But now, more than ever, it was necessary to go beyond, to climb higher, to explore the mountain's limits in search of the truth. With a mix of apprehension and hope, the final expedition prepared to face whatever awaited them in that treacherous and enigmatic region. The investigative team was composed of experienced mountaineers, scientists, and specialists in mountain weather and geography, and of course members of Michael's family. This wouldn't just be a scientific expedition. It had a deep emotional significance, as Michael's parents, Martha and Richard, were among those present. For them, the pain of their son's disappearance had never been overcome. They knew the price of finding answers could be high, perhaps even higher than what the mountain was willing to give. Anxiety and expectation hung in the air. This was the last chance to solve Michael's riddle, to bring some peace to their hearts, to finally understand what had really happened to him in that distant 2010. But as the mountain had shown throughout the process, it would not give up its answers easily. The mission began with the investigators and mountaineers preparing to face the extreme conditions of McKinley, one of the world's most imposing and treacherous peaks. The mountain, like an unyielding giant, seemed to observe the small humans who risked themselves under its relentless conditions. In the first days of the expedition, the weather quickly demonstrated its inhospitable character. The freezing winds and temperatures that hovered around 40 centigrades made it clear that McKinley was not willing to yield its answers easily. The snowstorm that formed during the early moments of the ascent transformed the landscape into a white canvas, with visibility reduced to almost nothing. With each step taken, the members of the expedition were aware that they were fighting against an invisible and powerful adversary, nature. But there was a much greater motivation that kept them moving forward. For Michael's family, especially his parents, this expedition wasn't just a search for the truth. It was an attempt to find a sense of closure. Martha and Richard Harris, with their broken hearts, were determined to understand what had happened to their son, whether he had failed or if he had been the victim of something bigger than he could have ever understood. They knew that the outcome might not be what they hoped, but the simple act of trying to solve the mystery gave them a sense of control over something that had, for so long, been out of their reach. As extreme as the conditions were, as much as McKinley continued to challenge their strength, nothing could stop them from moving forward. As the team neared the exact location where Michael's equipment had been found years before, the tension in the expedition grew. The setting was so isolated and desolate that, for a moment, it felt as though they were traveling to the end of the world. The glaciers stretched for miles, with no sign of life or human warmth in sight, as if the mountain itself had swallowed everything that existed there. The silence of the environment was only interrupted by the sound of the cutting wind and the heavy breathing of the expedition members. Each step became a constant struggle against the weather, against fatigue, and above all, against the fear of what they might find. The area where Michael's equipment had been found seemed untouched, as if time had stopped there. When the team reached the exact spot, the biting cold and the sense of isolation heightened the tension for everyone involved. Every member of the expedition knew that this might be the last place Michael had been alive, the final piece of his journey still left to be uncovered. However, what they found was not a definitive solution, but yet another mystery wrapped in ice and fog. The investigation team began to take measurements and analyze the area with meticulous detail. The questions began to accumulate. Had Michael come to this point alone, or was he with someone? And what about the mysterious object found with his equipment? Was there something geological or scientific in the location he had discovered before disappearing? Or was what he found not of a scientific nature, but something much darker? The heavy atmosphere of the mountain seemed to exude a sense that it was guarding its secrets with almost human fervor. As the investigation deepened, an idea began to take hold among the expedition members. Michael hadn't just disappeared. He had found something there, something that could have changed his perception of the mountain, or even his life. As the hours passed and the team delved deeper into McKinley's remote areas, the expedition grew even more dangerous. The weather grew more aggressive, and the cutting winds nearly prevented the team from advancing further. It was a test of physical and emotional endurance, but more than ever, they were determined to find answers. The feeling of being close to the end of such a long and uncertain journey fueled the team. However, what they found was yet another step toward a truth much greater than anyone had imagined. Suddenly, during a deeper analysis, one of the investigators noticed something that hadn't been recorded before. In the snow around Michael's equipment, there were marks, almost imperceptible, but visible enough to trained eyes. These marks indicated that someone or something had been there recently, and they weren't related to a simple shift in the environment. The sense of being onto something important overtook everyone. Could it be that Michael had had one final interaction with someone on the mountain before disappearing? Or did the mysterious object have something to do with an unknown interaction? The atmosphere of mystery grew even thicker. Tension reached its peak when an unexpected discovery was made. What appeared to be a natural crack in the rock revealed a small hidden compartment. Inside this compartment, a metal capsule was found.
When opened, the team found a letter that was visibly worn, but still legible. The letter appeared to have been written by Michael, but with a disconcerting tone. In his words, he described something he had found, something he believed to be of great scientific importance. But that also left him with an indescribable sense of fear. He spoke of something he had discovered on the mountain, something he didn't fully understand, but knew was too important to ignore.
The letter ended with a phrase that echoed in everyone's mind. "I know what I found, but I don't know what to do with it." The atmosphere of tension, mixed with the feeling that the truth was finally within reach, turned that moment into a dramatic milestone. Michael's letter seemed to be the last piece of the puzzle, but it also made it clear that something had happened on the mountain that was beyond anyone's understanding. McKinley, with its deep secrets, had protected not only Michael's life, but something he believed to be important enough to risk his own life for. After years of uncertainty and twists, the investigation into Michael Harris's disappearance reached a turning point, leading to revelations and confrontations that finally began to shed light on the mystery surrounding his death. The final expedition, which dragged on through McKinley's most remote and treacherous regions, led to the discovery of something no one had imagined: Michael's letter, hidden in a metal capsule within a rock crevice. That letter, with its words written under the weight of an unsettling discovery, became the key to understanding everything that had happened to the young mountaineer. The letter not only answered many of the questions that had tormented his family and investigators, but also opened new doors to what seemed to be the real reason behind his disappearance. It turns out that Michael wasn't just climbing McKinley to conquer any peak or challenge his own limits. He had found something extraordinary, something that, according to his own description, had the power to transform the understanding of the region's geology. In his words, Michael had discovered a rare geological formation, a feature that, according to his notes, could represent a discovery of great scientific relevance. But at the same time, there was fear in his words. Michael couldn't fully comprehend what he had found, and that left him uneasy. He was confronted with a revelation he didn't know how to deal with, and that caused his obsession with reaching the summit and his search for more answers to intensify. Michael, in his relentless pursuit of something greater than himself, ignored the danger signs and pressed on, believing that what he had found could change the course of history. The letter also revealed something even more disturbing. Michael had begun to feel that he wasn't alone on the mountain. Although he never specified to whom or what he was referring, his final message was filled with a sense of unease. He mentioned that he felt something was watching him. The words weren't clear enough to define whether he meant a human presence or something more enigmatic, but the mere fact that he mentioned this raised an important question. Could Michael have encountered something or someone on the mountain that interfered with his journey? The doubt about the nature of what he found, coupled with the fear of an unknown presence, added a layer of complexity to his disappearance. With the letter in hand, the investigation into Michael's death began to take a more concrete direction, although still shrouded in mystery. Investigators began considering the possibility that the geological discovery Michael made could be the key to understanding not only his death, but also the role the mountain played in his journey. McKinley, known for its imposing beauty, but also its treacherous nature, seemed to have a more central role in Michael's death than anyone had imagined. The letter revealed that, in his quest for self-overcoming, Michael may have gone beyond his own limits, not just physically but mentally, when he encountered a discovery he didn't fully understand. However, the question of whether Michael had truly found something of great scientific importance still lingered. No clear or formal evidence of what Michael had discovered was ever found, but the impact of his letter was enough to change the perception of everyone following the case. The geological discovery, though unconfirmed by others, seemed to have been the real reason Michael got lost in the mountains. This made sense in many ways. He wasn't just after the simple conquest of a peak. Michael Harris wanted to leave a mark on the history of science, but the mountain didn't allow him to do so. In his search for the truth, he found an even greater mystery, something that, it seemed, would have been his own undoing. But the discovery didn't just shed light on what had happened to Michael. It also provoked deeper reflection on the human failures that contributed to his disappearance. The negligence in the search efforts, the lack of communication, and the delays in rescue operations meant that, when the time finally came to find Michael, it was too late. The failures in the rescue operations, as pointed out by mountaineers and search team members, were undeniable. The area where Michael's equipment was found had been neglected, and the time wasted searching in the wrong places was a critical factor that contributed to the tragedy. Even when the final expedition took place, McKinley, with its vastness and relentless conditions, didn't easily give up its answers. But there was something more the mountain was hiding. The theory that began to gain traction among the investigators was that, by making this scientific discovery, Michael might have touched something that should have remained hidden. Not necessarily something threatening, but something that someone or some institution wanted kept secret. Michael's feeling that he wasn't alone on the mountain raised an even more disturbing hypothesis. Could it be that he was being watched? Something about Michael's discovery might have caused external forces, perhaps even someone from the scientific community or organizations with a vested interest in keeping that information hidden, to observe or even silence him? Michael's letter didn't make a direct accusation, but the idea that he felt not alone only deepened the atmosphere of mystery. Based on all these revelations, Michael Harris's case finally seemed to be heading toward a conclusion, though in a way no one could have anticipated. The truth about his death wasn't simple or conventional. It involved more than the failures of an expedition or the chance of a tragic accident. Michael had done something that could have changed science, but he paid with his life for it. The human failures in the search efforts and the negligence of the authorities were also determining factors in his death. And more importantly, the feeling that the mountain with its hidden secrets would never allow the full truth to come to light. Still, justice was served. The truth, though fragmented and imperfect, was revealed. Michael Harris, in his search for the truth and the overcoming of his limits, had found something deeper than he could have understood. McKinley, which held so many mysteries, finally delivered its story, although, as always, with more questions than answers. Michael Harris's legacy, his courage, and his quest for discovery would now live on, not only as a warning for future generations of mountaineers, but also as a reminder that some mountains never fully reveal their secrets. When the truth finally came to light about Michael Harris's disappearance, it didn't bring the kind of relief that was expected. The pain of losing a son, a brother, a friend, remained immeasurable, but there was something profoundly transformative in the way his family and the investigators dealt with the outcome. For Martha and Richard, Michael's parents, the end of the search didn't mean that the emptiness left by their son would be filled. But the letter found, written by Michael, brought a sense of closure that had previously seemed impossible. It revealed that Michael, in his quest for self-overcoming and something beyond himself, had found something of great importance, something that could change the understanding of the world, something that, in a way, justified the intensity of his mission. He wasn't just seeking a physical goal. He was after something that transcended the climb itself. In the days and weeks following the final expedition, Michael's family began to reflect on what had really motivated their son to take such risks. He had always been a determined young man, an audacious mountaineer. But what drove him to go so deep, to risk his life in search of something he barely understood? Martha and Richard wondered if they could have done more to understand Michael's obsession with climbing mountains, with reaching what was beyond his grasp. Could they, as parents, have offered more emotional support, or even dissuaded his decision to climb McKinley alone? The pain of the loss never completely fades, but Michael's letter at least brought a sense of direction to that pain. He wasn't just trying to overcome himself. He was trying to understand something greater, something that couldn't be easily explained, but that he felt was essential to his journey.
The final expedition, which brought to light the letter and revelations about Mike the story. For the investigators and climbers involved, it became clear that Michael wasn't just another victim of McKinley's relentless nature. He was someone who, in his pursuit of the summit, found something extraordinary, and, in trying to reach the unknown, paid the price for his own obsession.
The mountain, which had been the stage of his journey, wasn't just an obstacle. It was also an enigma, holding deep secrets. Michael's tragedy was intertwined with these secrets. His death wasn't a mere accident, but a reflection of an unfinished journey, a search for answers that became dangerously consuming. The reflection on Michael's death also brought up a fundamental question for everyone involved. How far are we willing to go in pursuit of what drives us, whether it's a personal goal, a scientific truth, or a spiritual accomplishment? Michael, with his relentless pursuit, wasn't just overcoming the physical, he was overcoming the psychological. He was, perhaps unknowingly, trying to discover something that transcended logic, something that could change the very view of life and the natural world. And perhaps that's why he continued, even when there were clear signs that the mountain was becoming an unbeatable enemy. He felt that, to reach something truly significant, he would have to surpass all his limits. And this obsession, while understandable for someone so determined, also placed him in a situation of imminent danger. On the other hand, the end of the story brought an important reflection on the human failures that contributed to his death. The negligence in the search efforts, the lack of communication, and the rushed management of the rescue operations were critical factors that, without a doubt, impacted the outcome. McKinley, with its treacherous geography, demanded extreme precision in coordinating the search, but the lack of focus and mistakes made by those involved in crucial moments of the rescue effort resulted in an even deeper tragedy. Even with Michael's equipment being found years later, the failure to adequately explore the area and the time wasted in poorly planned searches made the mission even more challenging. But ultimately, the human failures weren't what Michael was seeking. He didn't want to be rescued. He wanted to discover something that could change the world, and that led him to go beyond any reason he might have had. The loss of Michael, therefore, wasn't just a tragic event, but also an opportunity for us to reflect on the limits of the human spirit. For his parents, and for those involved in the investigation, the search for the truth became more than just a mission to understand what happened in that fateful 2010. It was also about understanding the reasons behind the choices Michael made, the motivations that pushed him to risk so much. Michael was, undoubtedly, a symbol of an insatiable quest for the unknown, and his death became a metaphor for the constant struggle between the need for self-overcoming and the recognition of human limits. The final reflection on Michael Harris's life and death was one that touched everyone involved in his journey. For the family, the pain of the loss was inevitable, but the revelation that their son had found something meaningful, something he believed was greater than himself, brought a certain comfort. Michael wasn't lost for no reason. His death was part of a larger process, an unceasing search for a deeper understanding of the natural world. And although he couldn't share this discovery with the world, his journey wasn't in vain. McKinley, with all its challenges and mysteries, became the stage not just for a tragedy but for a lesson on how far we are willing to risk for the truth. As Michael's family reflected on their son's life, they began to see McKinley not just as a place of pain, but as a monument to the ceaseless quest, the spirit of discovery, and the courage to go beyond one's limits. They knew that Michael had left a legacy that, though not what he had planned, had impact. His sacrifice, like that of so many other mountaineers, was made in the name of something greater. McKinley, with its eternal silence, held the secrets of many, but now, for the Harris family, it also held the memory of a son who dared to go beyond and sought something that, though invisible to the eyes of many, had deep meaning for him.